But you will find sometimes, like some of the really stark shachs in Shulchan Aruch, is he basically has a read of the Gemara, and it feels that all the Rishonim and Achronim got it wrong, and he basically like forces his read through, and then tries to claim that they held like him anyway. But that's when you like really feel like this is the emislam. This is clearly the pshat, as opposed to here, it's a possibility. So I think that makes it different. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes.
We also we gave a bunch of options, and I think one thing we could do maybe is to eliminate those options that we think are against halakha.
Mm-hmm.
But then once we take the ones that are left and we think are halakha viable options, we could also just ask the individual person which one they think would be best for them. Do you want to stay in shul and not go up, or do you want to go up and not make a bracha, or do you want to leave and kind of let them choose?
Right.
Once you determine first that those are all halakha okay.
Right. I think that's an interesting question about about sort of laying out options and letting somebody choose, and that's I think a question a lot about halacha. First of all, somebody has to want to be part of that process, even forgetting the whole issue about inclusion and disabilities. Plenty of cases where somebody asks me, says, there's this position, there's that position, there's this position. Rabbi, just tell me what to do. I think that's like most people, number one, in general, so they have to sort of want to be part of that process. I do think that it raises an interesting point, which is that if you think there are a couple of halachically equally viable options, to what degree can you sort of say these are sort of equally viable, and you could decide as well as I could decide. I'm a little bit reluctant, it's a larger conversation. I have to say there was hesitation about that is particularly today, because on the one hand I do want to sort of see myself not always as embodying authority, but also empowering people in the process. On the other hand, today where people go on the web and they basically have a shaila and they find one site that one person says it's okay, it's a total shopping around for the psak that you want. Right, and so I think that we really are threatened today with taking the seriousness of the halachic process appropriately, and what that weight of judgment and decision making makes. So to just say, oh, here's your menu. I gave you the menu after we all worked through this year together, and we all sort of are grappled with the sources. To go to somebody and say, here's your menu. I find that. Problematic in terms of the larger sort of message that it sends, of just find the different shitot and make your own decision, as opposed to really sort of weighing the various considerations. The other thing I'll say is also in terms of the inclusion aspect, if you say, well, you could be somach on the Ravan and you could make a bracha, or you could whatever, b'diavad, then, how does that help in terms of that person sort of feeling included? Some of those cheshbonos you might want to keep to yourself, So I'm not exactly sure I would sort of lay options out for the person. I might want to explore the questions of, what I would say to the person is, how would it feel to make the Birkas Kohanim up without doing the bracha? How do you think you would handle that emotionally? How would that make you feel in terms of that experience? I would want to hear that in order that I could bring that into the cheshbon of how much am I prepared to then think about, kavod brios, Birchas HaTorah, there's a Ravan, Birchas HaTorah, there's a Ravan, and so on. So those are types of sort of data that I would want to get. But so I definitely want to engage the person, but I think it's different engaging the person as laying out options and just say pick the one that works for you. Other thoughts?
Okay. You can go through the fellow questions first. I'll go
What? Okay. Yeah.
First, I have a question. Let's say you decide he's allowed to go up and say Birkat Kohanim without a bracha. How comfortable would you feel the requirement to tell him that it's that you're not really being go and say Birkat Kohanim in any sense, or would you feel comfortable hiding that from the person?
Yeah, I think that. Well, first of all, you'll have to explain why you're telling him not to make a bracha. If you think he's, why can't I make a bracha, right? What do you mean don't make a bracha? So, that's going to be an obvious question. But I do think that question is a really important one, sort of the question about paternalism, within the area of psak halacha, but it's not always a bad thing. I'll give you an example, I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but sometimes the question comes up, a lot of things you find posting some Hilchos Neder questions, if somebody asks a shayla, so b'diavad, it might be okay, but don't tell people b'diavad you can do this, because then, they'll start doing it l'chatchila. So you have to say you can't do this, and then if they ask a shayla, but if something comes up, then talk to me, and then whatever, and then then you'll paskin. But don't outright say, but yeah, it's okay, because then they'll come up. So you say, well, that's very patronizing. We're all adults. Go ahead and tell me what the halacha is, and trust me to know what the b'di'evets are. So and to keep those as b'di'evets. So on the one hand, that's true, and on the other hand, so when somebody's coming to you for psak halacha, what they're also asking from you is not just information. What they're also asking from you is guidance to help me do what halachically I should be doing. And I totally accept that there's a patronizing element to this, but let's say the reality is for me to help you do what you want, what you really want from me is to help you do the halacha, that's going to require me to not necessarily put everything on the table. Okay, and that's what's going to most help you keep the halacha. So you could say, look, that there's a cost to that, because then they'll find out, and then it undermines authority, and then anyway there's a cost just in terms of respect. But I do think that these are like real questions and real issues in terms of, how much do you share everything? So I think that that's a good question. I think here, if you're telling the person not to make a bracha, you would have to address. You can't pretend that it's totally yotzei if your psak is that you're telling him not to make a bracha. But I'm not sure you have to tell somebody everything, particularly also if it's about, the issue of, like this issue we're dealing with, this is one of inclusion. So if you say it's totally fine, yes, you can do Birkas Kohanim, you might want to say, maybe, let's say that was your position. So you have to tell them, because you can be somech on the Shvus Yaakov, because it's a Shas HaTachak, and there's the Ravan, that completely sort of would have the effect of undermining their sense of really being included. So, in your case, where you're saying don't make the bracha, I don't see how you could hide the information. But and if people want to push back, I welcome you to push back. But to me, I feel that if somebody pushes, you don't have to, just because you have to be truthful doesn't mean you have to always be fully forthcoming. And I do think that there's other values at stake than just completely laying all the information on the table. There's other values. Somebody wants to do halacha, so you might not want to share everything if it's going to lead to them to not fully observe halacha. Somebody wants to be included, you might not want to share all the information if it's going to lead to a feeling of being still in a b'di'evet category. So I just think that there are other values than than just totally like being fully intellectually forthcoming. But again, if you want to push back, be my guest.
That's another question. We left out the whole idea of like moving and
Right.
distraction.
Right.
How would that play into this?
It's too late. I'm not getting into that conversation. Okay, dash be'iro, clearly. Some of you got dash be'iro, but I don't want to open up that new can of worms right now. Okay, other comments? Yes.
Do you think the idea of inclusion is any less relevant when we're dealing with something like Birkat Kohanim, which by its very nature is somewhat exclusive?
So that's an interesting question. I was thinking all along as I was giving this shir, and I was trying to be careful of this, but at appropriate stages saying, she or he, him or her, but I couldn't say it when I got to the case of Birkas Kohanim, because that was all males and all Kohanim. So, it is true, right? This is a classic, something which is highly hierarchical. I think that there's still just the emotional, psychological, religious reality of the person experiencing it. It doesn't really matter that in some objective sense, anyway, this was a hierarchical thing, so good, so you'll be one of Klal Yisrael, big deal, right? So, when you read that the Shaila to Rav Lau, right, it was very poignant. And people will definitely feel that way, and they feel shunned and rejected. I mean, Shelley Cohen, who spoke, she tells about how her son, she's a Cohen, she's not married to a Cohen, she tells about how her son, towards the end of his life, the one thing that really made him feel part of the community was that when he was able to go up and do Birkas Kohanim in a wheelchair, right? And that's what he did. So I think that, I think it's a good question to ask, but I think that's why you really have to know how the person is experiencing it. Some Shuvah said that. Big deal, so you don't do Birkas Kohanim. A lot of us don't do Birkas Kohanim. You're still part of Klal Yisrael. So maybe if that's how the person is feeling, then, that gets back to the other point. Maybe you want to talk to the person. Maybe you don't want to make a big global policy, right? So I think that's all very relevant. Your thoughts? Yeah.
Noam says, technically the Rambam also excludes Ashkenazim. If you read it through his definition of it. And then the Chayat of course comes in and says, well, you can do it if you're an Ashkenazi shul, so.
Right. So we could look at other areas in halacha where we tolerate difference. Rabbi Clapper?
Yeah, I have three things I think.
Okay.
One is, I guess, what happens in public discourse? Let's suppose the Rabban means what you want it to mean. So what happens in public discourse when I don't think you could ever tell somebody, this is usher, but you can do it because it makes you feel better.
Right, that gets back to the earlier point.
Yeah.
You
What-
cannot, this is one of those cases where if you put the reasons on the surface, I mentioned that when I brought the Rabban up, right, it's very much undermining to the goals.
So what happens in public discourse when,
Right.
if you put a principle like that out? That, or if they say, that I'm willing to paskin, that if people feel excluded, I will override all the Rabbanan, except for people who know that this is the basis of my thought. So is this not just one of the principles that can't function when halakhic discourse is public?
Right, I do agree that I do think that, that this won't fly in practice for a couple of reasons. One, because it has not had a voice until now in halacha. Number two, because people will see it as a complete slippery slope, and then there's, just way too broad and dangerous. And number three, because it will be, for those that are looking for a more inclusive psak, it will be seen as, as undermining some of the goals that it's working to achieve. I agree with that. I do think that some people, there are definitely people that don't care how you get to the end result. They just want the psak in the end. How many people really are able to and care enough to think through what the arguments are? They just want to know how you're poskening. So the small number of people that actually care about the arguments, though, are maybe the sort of more rabbinic audience, and they're the ones that this can help in the conversation. But I don't know. I mean, I do think it's problematic. I mean, there's a reason that I have not trumpeted the Ravan in addition to the fact that it has until now not been part of the discourse, because I do think that at the same time that it leads to a high degree of inclusion in practice, it is also highly patronizing in terms of the approach. So I do think it's deeply problematic
Well,
that way.
so I want to push, and this relates to the last point, but
Yeah.
so I want to build to it slowly. But it's not just that it's patronizing, I don't think. It's that it forces you ultimately, if you want to draw a line, to say, I don't believe you, or I don't trust you. Because someone can come up to you and say, you know what, this makes me feel excluded, this makes me feel excluded, it's only Drabanan, right? Your psak is, that it makes me feel excluded. And ultimately, you have to say, no, I don't believe you. I think you're just saying that. Because,
I don't understand at all what you're saying. If you say Kedai Lismo Fishas Hadachak,
No, if you take the Ravan.
or all the other times where we rely on positions because of the sort of inner human experience that's so how do you say, well, I can't do it because sometimes people I won't believe when they make that claim. So I can't go ahead and make psak based on that.
Well, I think that's part of why I wonder, right? I wonder about Shas Hadchak public positions when, I guess here, let's put it in a broader term, and I want to go back to it's Rav Yashiv, right, in this case?
I think so, I have to check.
Yeah, so I have a very different understanding of how that shuvah comes out, which is surprising to me. I want this on tape, but I'm defending it.
Okay.
But it seems to me that there's the cost in coming and doing things case by case,
Yeah.
as you end up having to evaluate people.
Right.
And that's a cost, right,
Right.
as opposed to having rules and letting people,
Right.
and there's a danger in making rules that just ultimately says that the only rule here is the rabbi gets to decide
Right.
how much you care about this, how sincere you are about this,
Right.
and I'm not sure you really,
Okay.
how much you really want
So
that.
I agree. To me, the more appealing one, although a number of the participants here have raised the issue about to have this conversation with each person and decide how much is not making the bracha a real issue, how much is a sushas hadachak, and so on. I agree that that's not the approach that's appealing to me. A, because of the reason that you say, and B, because I think that it also, getting to the theme of inclusion, basically constantly reinforces a second-class status and only special circumstances as opposed to a more fundamental, embracing of diversity. So I completely agree that I don't find that approach appealing. But but anyway, I mean, nevertheless, it's a common part of the halachic practice is assessing people's faith. So if you really see the only way I can approach this is a special case in Shas Hadachak, then no different than any other halachic areas where you're prepared to do certain things b'shas hadachak, and that the rabbi has to make a decision. But I agree with you, I don't like that approach here. I think it's very counter to some of the values that are at play here.
Well, the question is, sorry, the question is, surely, if your outcome is to include everybody, so you're happier including everybody, right, in a broad swath, then you are including them, having them ask questions case by case.
Right.
And at some point, it becomes demeaning to have people ask questions case by case.
Right.
But the question is whether there aren't times when it's better to exclude some people. Right? Is it just the value of not being put in a position where you constantly have to judge people's motives, the value? So I want to just.
Right.
It's a very.
But I just want to say two brief things. First of all, yes, I certainly think there's a value both because of A, you might not feel comfortable halachically to have the broad heter, and you might feel only comfortable halachically in order to do it as treated as a shas hadachak, so there's your own personal integrity, and B, in terms of also the issue that it communicates to the larger community, there are these competing issues. There's the one thing about inclusion, treating people as second class and so on, and there's the other thing about seriousness in terms of the whole approach to halach and so on. So there clearly are these sort of competing issues that are at play. And certainly you have to be true to yourself in terms of the integrity of the halacha. But the other thing I do want to say is that when the Ravan says that women make brachas because of nachas ruach lenashim, he did not have every woman come to him and ask her how much she would feel excluded if she didn't make a birchas hamitzvah. He's dealing with a class of people and what it means to be including that class or excluding that class. So I think you can use the Ravan's approach. We're talking about the Ravan and in a non-case by case basis. But anyway.
So I guess the last point I want to try to make is with his case Shiva. So if you read the whole thing through,
Yeah.
right, there's an amazing number of steps. Right? First, you're voting yourself to see if you can stand through all of your Kohanim.
Right.
Then you're voting yourself to see if you can stand for one word, and then have an indefinite break in between, and then stand for other words.
Right.
And an indefinite break and stand between. Right? And as long as you decide for yourself. Right? Nobody else is making this decision for you. As long as you decide for yourself that you are capable of standing long enough to say one word, then you're allowed to go up.
Uh-huh.
Then he tells you should go out, but nobody's enforcing on you that you go out, and nobody could enforce on you that you're going out because you could decide and say, you know what, I thought I could stand, right, for one teva. So
There's some people for whom that cheshbon is irrelevant.
So it's interesting, and that's a separate in terms of your other activities that he never talks about. People who could never, right? The whole shuvah is framed as people who have conditions that make it questionable whether they can stand. It's people who are tired, old, or missing one leg.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He never talks about people in wheelchairs. I don't know whether he wouldn't have
You
had.
think he'd be more makil? I think, well, okay.
I don't know. He doesn't say.
Fine, yep.
Right? But the way the shuvah is framed, there's a very complicated calculus that every
Right.
individual goes through. There are lots of choice points, and if you leave the room, it's because you decided. Right, that's what your halachic condition is, and
No, you've decided that's what your physical condition is.
you decided that is the halacha.
The rabbi told you that if you don't feel that you'll be able to do X, you have to leave the room. You're not choosing halacha. You're making an assessment of your physical ability.
So
You're saying, well, you could lie to yourself and believe you are able to. I don't believe that. He's saying the rabbi gives you a psak, you assess your physical ability, you act accordingly.
So I think he leaves you the option if you don't, of just being swept up, right? You don't leave the room. He gives you a very clear thing what happens next. You listen to some other Kohen. He doesn't tell you. He never allows someone to eject you from your room, and I wonder if you're not missing the way in which the capacity to think about yourself halachically is itself empowering. That for some people. Now I think that the notion that for many people this is wholly irrelevant. But I wonder if for the audience he's writing for, or he thinks he's writing for at least, that there's just the experience of being able to think, the fact of being involved in Talmud Torah about yourself in a very serious way, and having a checklist where you're making constant religious decisions. I wonder if that's not
Okay, I think that's a legitimate point. I was not assuming for the entire presentation that case. I was assuming somebody that absolutely was wheelchair bound and had absolutely no options. So in the circumstance that you lay out, I think that does raise interesting things, and it gets back, I'm sorry, in the back, the name?
Davida?
Adina?
Davida.
Davida's point, I think that if you can involve people in a serious way in the halachic process, as opposed to just, take a pick, which one you like better, I completely agree that I think that that's, critically important. So I don't disagree with that point. But but that was just not my assumption of all these cases.
Right, I'm just not sure that his
Right.
tshuva
Fine.
is as.
I think the reason he dealt with that there was because that was a more interesting case than the wheelchair bound. There's very little to say about the wheelchair. I would highly doubt, maybe I'm wrong, but I would highly doubt he would be more inclusive in the wheelchair case. But, okay, anyway, some final points and then we really have to wrap up. Yes.
I just wanted to point out that for me, one of the biggest nafkaminas between Shas HaTchak and Nachas Ruach is that by Shas HaTchak, even if you can't be explicit that you're asking about how awful this is for the person, you still have to make an assessment of the situation as a posek. Whereas by Nachas Ruach, you may just be required to assess the category with no regard for the individual.
Exactly, thank you. Yes, that was the point. Yes, thank you very much. That was exactly the point I said, that the Ravan doesn't ask women individually. He sort of looks at the whole category. So, yes, thank you. I very much appreciate that. Davida.
So and just to clarify the point that I was making before is I think, say you decide that the halacha is that the person can say Birkat Kohanim without a bracha because then it's just psukim.
Right.
So once it's not psukim, they're not really technically doing Birkat Kohanim anyway. So
Right.
then I think whether they stay in shul or leave shul or go up doesn't really necessarily make it, is really following, they're sort of following the same halacha. So that's when I think you can ask them, like, do whichever thing you feel more comfortable with.
So you're not just, okay, so you're saying, look, I feel that you're not Yotzei Birchas Kohanim, that you can't be Yotzei the mitzvah Birchas Kohanim. So as such, though, there come out some options. You could say
Yeah.
Psukim, or you could not go up, or you could leave the shul.
Right.
Right. So that I think that's fine, because at least you're sort of positioning them in one psak and then giving them the options that emerge from that psak. But to say like, there's also a possibility you could make Birchas HaMitzvah if you want to be somech on this weird Ravon that I heard about, or the idea of Gadabriya, so you can decide whether or not you want to be somech on it. Like that I don't think would be appropriate unless somebody is really engaged in the halachic process in a serious way. But yes, thank you. Okay. So if there's not any more comments, it was a very, much longer than I expected it to be, but I really appreciate it. So if I stretch people's patience, then you have my apologies, but I very much appreciated the participation and the reflecting on these issues. And like I said, to me, in addition to the specific issues about this case, which is always, of course, important, I'd like you to continue to think about the question, which I know you do during the course of your time here, and you'll be doing in your tshuva, about when you're presented with different options, you have choices to make. You have choices to make about, I don't intellectually agree with this at all, but it's a position in the halachic system. Maybe I could be somech on it, even without necessarily agreeing with it. Is it deraisa, derabbanan, does it mean to be about das yachid, and so on. I'm going to paskin this way, which will have certain policy implications, but there's competing policy implications. And, and I'm going to be, do I take this psak, which is 100% what I think pshat of the things are, or do I say, I don't 100% believe it, but I think it's a tenable position, and if that leads to a position of, of more inclusion, more responsivity, more allowing people, greater participation. So I think that's, ultimately the real choice that, people have to make is not necessarily using your critical facility to assess the sources, which is obviously the first step, and but then really making the judgment call about what that means in terms of halacha. So, tonight we'll hear about, like I said, the Rav Moshe about the ger, which certainly says, at least in that case of the ger, he makes a very clear statement about a certain way in which he feels compelled when you have competing things about how that might influence the way in which you interpret certain things, whether, you always have to be 100% how you think the pshat of things are. But as I said, this really is a this is a big spectrum. And at different times you'll find yourself falling out at different places on that spectrum. I don't think it's anything that can be quantified, but I think it's something that we have to sort of step back and ask ourselves what really our decision process is all about.